Hi, I'm Joshua Knobe. I'm a professor of philosophy at UNC Chapel Hill.
And I'm John Haidt. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia.
And today we're going to be talking about the difference in perspective between liberals and conservatives and where this difference arises. So one common view about this difference is that it arises from a certain kind of reasoning. So you might think that liberals and conservatives appeal to different kinds of principles, or that liberals reason to a different kind of view from the one that conservatives hold. While another kind of view that you might have about this question is that it arises from difference in certain kind of intuitions. So, John, you've written a lot in general about this idea of moral judgments and the ways in which they're informed by reasoning or from intuition. Maybe we could start out by just talking in general about the kind of view you've adopted there.
Certainly. So when I was in graduate school, when I entered graduate school in 1987, the field of moral psychology was really all about the study of moral reasoning. Everybody was either using Lawrence Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan or critiquing them. And everyone was interested in the ways that children and teenagers and adults would change in their reasoning about right and wrong. But as I was reading all of that work, something just struck me as kind of dry and a little bit boring. It seemed to me that morality was a much more passionate affair. I'd been a philosophy major as an undergraduate, and I'd read some Hume, David Hume, and his view was that morality was really based in sentiment, in passions and gut feelings, and that reason is the servant of the passions. That felt right to me. That's the only way I can explain it as to how I got started on the line that I did. But my early research basically consisted in trying to sort of gross people out and shock them with stories that didn't involve any harm, and that if you thought about from a sort of a standard American vaguely liberal perspective, you'd say, well, people have a right to do what they want as long as they don't hurt someone else. So, for example, a story that I used in my dissertation was about a family that ate its pet dog after the dog was killed by a car in front of their house. So I had a bunch of stories about harmless, disgusting, or disrespectful actions. And most people would say, well, it's wrong, and even if it doesn't hurt anyone, it's still wrong, and they sometimes couldn't explain it. So that got me launched on basically a Humean research career of studying how it is that we have these quick, intuitive reactions. We're then very, very good at generating reasons. We can practically do that in our sleep. And so my view was that Kohlberg and the people studying moral reasoning were basically studying the tail that was wagged by the emotional dog.
But suppose we consider those people in the minority, those people who did say that it's wrong, for example, to eat your own dog. What would be the best explanation of their responses? Would the best explanation be that they just have an immediate, automatic, intuitive response that's different from most people's? Or would it be that they have the same response that most people do, but then they think about it and think, even though it feels wrong to me, maybe there's actually, when I reason about it, nothing wrong with it.
Yes, that's. I think there are several different things going on. In most of my studies, I would ask things like, if you actually saw this happening, would it bother you? And the people who said it was okay, or at least the groups in which groups of highly educated subjects, where people said, well, they have a right to do what they want. Their disgust was no different. They were not less disgusted about eating a dog. They just overrode their disgust. And there is some evidence from a variety of studies by Linda Skipke and others that liberals are more likely to challenge their first thought, to question. I think this is related to the stereotype about liberals, the negative stereotype about them as being flip-floppers, the positive stereotype being that they're open to the complexity of the world. So for starters, liberals and conservatives are, generally speaking, grossed out by most of the same things, and there is some truth that liberals may question that. And I even have some of my subjects would say things like, well, it's like an alarm bell goes off in my head, when thinking about gay sex or gay marriage or something like that. But, I know not to listen to that.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I think what's behind your question is the possibility that, maybe everyone has the same feelings overall. The difference is really to be found in what we do with those feelings. I think that's not quite right. I do think that if you showed people photographs, say, of the American flag being disrespected or being burned or being used in an art exhibit, I do think that there are a variety of feelings about country, about God, about respect in which we would find that conservatives have stronger feelings. And I'm doing some research on that now to look at people's implicit attitudes.
Oh, really? So what are you finding in your most recent research?
Well, so far, the results have been ambiguous. What we're doing is this is work I'm doing with my graduate student, Jesse Graham. We know we've got tons of data that matches others showing that if you ask people about actions that involve disrespect or disgust or violations of things that are unpatriotic, let's say, consciously, explicitly, conservatives are much more critical. That's obvious. We're doing some studies where we give people simple words like disrespect or subversive. And sometimes we find a small effect where you can measure the degree to which the positivity of a word facilitates the categorization of subsequent words. This is the basic idea behind studying implicit reactions. And so far, we don't have a clear story. We have some hints that liberals and conservatives both respond negatively to the negative words, like disrespect. But we have some hints of some small effects. I'm pretty confident that if we use a full spectrum of words and we get it all right, we're going to find differences. So, for example, think about movie reviews or book reviews. What's one of the highest words of praise you can give to a work of art created by a liberal? Subversive. You want your work to be subversive because whatever structures are out there are generally bad. Institutions are bad. The existing order is bad. And if you can subvert it, that's good.
So if we did this test on liberal artists from university towns, we would expect that their implicit attitude would be that subversive means good.
That's right. I've not yet used the word subversive itself, but that's the line of research that I'm on to try to figure out how deep these differences go.
So is your thought then that part of the reason why liberals and conservatives have different ultimate moral judgments is that they start out with kind of different feelings? As soon as they sort of experience something as being subversive, or as soon as they walk in and see someone performing a certain action, there's a kind of automatic reaction, and that it differs between what the conservatives have and what the liberals have.
Yes, that's right. Let me just add two caveats to that. The first is that to understand this difference, you really have to understand the difference in the breadth of the moral domain. I hope you and I will get into that. Probably the most important lesson I'm trying to put out there, especially in sort of liberal and democratic circles, is that the moral domain varies in size, and that for liberals, it's pretty much limited to issues of harm and fairness, and includes justice and rights. But for most people in the world, and for most societies throughout history, morality has been much more about group cohesion, about suppressing selfishness, so that collective enterprises can go forward. And I do think that conservatives are sort of better at tribalism, which sounds bad when you put it that way. But we'll get into that a little bit later, why it is that is, in a sense, really what morality is about, and we can't just discard our ancient morality.
Right, this is a very interesting suggestion, but I wonder there could be another possible view, which would be that liberals have this sort of immediate, automatic reaction when someone is doing something that breaks their cohesion, that they immediately feel bad about it. But then they stop for a moment and try to stop themselves from doing that, control their immediate reaction. But that their first intuition is maybe this conservative one, and then they have to sort of force themselves to have the idea that maybe it's okay for someone to do something that's violating certain kinds of societal norms.
Well, yes, that is possible. That is within the realm of what of possible mechanisms, what's possibly going on. But I think, and I'm beginning to do some experiments just by giving people patterns of dots to look at. I think that liberals generally look out on the world and see individual agents who have to be protected and who have rights attached to them. I think conservatives are more likely to see groups, families, tribes, nations, collective entities. I'm just beginning to collect evidence on this, so I can't say that with any authority yet. But I do think that when we look at these collective sentiments, we are going to find more differences. Let me just get to that second caveat, because I'm sure some people watching this have a neuron somewhere back there that said there were two caveats, and I only gave one.
Okay.
And it's relevant here, which is that in any discussion of liberals and conservatives, we've got to be really clear that it's not a single dimension, that there are subtypes of liberals, there are subtypes of conservatives. And when I'm talking about conservatives, I'm only talking about social conservatives, the prototypes being the religious right, those who really want a thick moral order, in which people are supposed to control their bodies, their carnality. There is much more a sense of authority and hierarchical structure. So I'm talking primarily about social conservatives. Libertarians or laissez-faire conservatives aren't really conservatives at all. In fact, in many ways, they're more like liberals in their moral values, even though they've tended to vote Republican in recent years. And then on the left, I'm talking about sort of your standard sort of prototypical sort of PC liberal, the extreme prototype being the sort of the academic, politically correct liberal. Within liberalism, you get the religious left, which has a much sort of thicker morality that has a lot of conservative elements. You get sort of communists and socialists who are very collectivist and groupish. So it's a complex topography. It's a complex space. When we say liberals and conservatives, lots of people who are listening to this are going to feel left out. Are going to feel, well, that's not true about me. So this is one of the most active areas of research in ideology now, is these subtypes.
So if we went to the really extreme left, do you think we might again find these values that you're talking about, this loyalty to the in-group, importance of group cohesion and so forth, this idea that us, the extreme left, have to be victorious over our enemies? And so
Yes, I do think we find that. It's kind of hard to graph out here, but there's a kind of a wraparound, almost like on the color wheel, where red and blue join up again. Oh my goodness! It's how interesting that it's red and blue. I didn't even occur to me. So the main direction that a lot of my research is taking now is the idea that morality is really a team sport. We have to understand morality in the context of group competition. And to the extent that people say that they are far left or radical left or far right or radical right, to the extent that they say that, what they're basically saying is that they are really strongly identified with the team. And so if you're extreme on either side, you're going to get this kind of radical belief that, to pursue our agenda, some people are going to have to get hurt, and we're each going to have to, do our part and accept constraints. So you get the horrors of fascism and the horrors of communism. Even though they're different in some ways. The sort of the real nasty collectivism that is really the libertarian's reason for being. You do find that on both the far left and the far right. Yes.
So if we go to the extremes, we're basically going to what you think of as being conservative, regardless of what the extreme is.
Oh, I see. If by conservative you mean tribal collectivist, that would be true. But I think there's several. When we say conservative, and here I'll go with John Jost, a professor at NYU, who's one of the leading experts here. I think he writes very well about this. He says the two features of conservatism are tolerance of or even liking for inequality, hierarchy, structure like that, and also resistance to change. So in terms of hierarchy, I think that generally doesn't wrap around fully. I think in general the left is much more egalitarian and morally opposed to hierarchy, and the right is not in general. And also with change, same thing with change. I think on the left you generally find, across the left, a general liking for change and variety, and across the right, again, not libertarians, they shouldn't really be considered to be on the right, but social conservatives, to be conservative means to want to conserve what was.
So you've argued in the past that one way to understand the difference between liberals and conservatives is in terms of a difference of what kinds of foundations they have for morality, with 5 foundations for conservatives and only 2 for liberals. Do you think you could say a little bit about this aspect?
Sure, yeah, right. That's probably a good idea to orient listeners, viewers, to what we're talking about here. So I've always been fascinated by the question of how do we explain the fact that morality is so variable around the world, but at the same time you find really eerie similarities. You find, say, reciprocity everywhere. Everybody cares about reciprocity. Everyone has some idea of fairness. Everybody has some idea about harm. And so by surveying a bunch of anthropological theories from some minimal fieldwork that I did in India when I was a postdoc, from theories of my former advisors, Alan Fisk and Rick Schwader, I put a lot of things out on the table and said, okay, what are what are the kinds of virtues and intuitions and moral goods that everybody's talking about. And at the same time, let's look at evolutionary theories. What are the kinds of theories that are being talked about in evolution that might explain why we are structured to have the kinds of minds that we have? And I found basically 5 matches, and that's what the 5 foundations are. The 2 most basic and universal are concerns about harm related to care. We're mammals. We have an attachment system. We don't like to see other people suffer, especially if they're kin or if they're weak or young. So that's the first foundation, is harm and care. The second is fairness, reciprocity. There's a lot of research on reciprocal altruism, tit for tat, that sort of thing. So those 2 are universal, and what I've found is that liberals endorse questions and items related to those 2, and exclusively those 2. Conservatives endorse those 2, but there are 3 additional areas, 3 additional clusters of moral concerns where conservatives, in every study I've done, endorse these more. So number 3 is in-group loyalty. If you have the idea, my country, right or wrong, that is offensive to a liberal. But the idea that sometimes you've just got to play along, you've got to be a team player and not express yourself, and that is a good thing, that is much more likely to be endorsed by conservatives, although of course not libertarians. The 4th foundation is authority and respect. If the word backtalk or uppity, if those mean anything to you, if those mean anything good to you, or not good, but I mean, if you think that those are bad things, then you probably have more conservative sentiments, whereas the very idea of a person acting above their station, if the very idea that people have stations is offensive to you, then you're more likely to have liberal sentiments. And then the 5th foundation is purity and sanctity. Now, this is one that many liberals have great difficulty with. They seem to think it's just about cleanliness or something like that. It's exemplified on the right with this incredible moralization of sex, the idea that what you do with your body is not your own business, that you have to live in a way that is consonant with God's wishes, consonant with the fact that we have divinity within us. But we do find hints of this on the left, especially, I think, in the area of food. People on the left greatly moralize food, obviously for harm and fairness issues in terms of animal cruelty and workers' rights. But I think we find elements of this idea of sort of moral purity, of taking purity into your body, or of not doing things that will degrade you in terms of toxins and corporate food, and keeping yourself clean in terms of pursuing organic food. So the idea that what you do with your body somehow changes your moral status, that's really what this idea of purity, sanctity is all about. So those are the 5 foundations.
So what you're suggesting so far is that we find in our culture now 2 main groups of people. So on one hand, there are the group of people, the liberals, who mainly value 2 of these foundations. On the other hand, there's another group, the conservatives, who are valuing all 5. But is there an explanation of why we find this split like that? Why is it, for example, that we don't find people who place an enormous value on the virtue of authority, but don't care at all about purity? Or who care a great deal about purity, but not at all about authority? Why is it that these 2 are going together in a single group? The conservatives who care about both.
Right. Well, the advantage, I think, of the 5 foundations theory, and if viewers want to learn more about it, if you go to moralfoundations.org, you can see the theory laid out and read some papers on it. The advantage of the theory, I think, over just talking about liberals and conservatives, is that you have basically 5 slider switches. Like, think about it in terms of an audio equalizer. With an audio, on some stereos, you can turn the tone. It used to be called tone. You turn it down, you get more bass. Turn it up, you get more treble. So that's a one-dimensional adjustment. And you might think, well, there are liberals and conservatives. But with 5 foundations theory and with the various scales we've developed to measure it, you actually get a profile for each person. And even though there are some common patterns, and the 2 that you mentioned are probably the most common patterns, you can get all kinds of other patterns. So just as if you imagine an audio equalizer with 5 slider switches, so you have one pattern of settings for jazz and another pattern for gospel, and it's not just up or down. We do find a bunch of different patterns. I recently did a cluster analysis of. We've collected a lot of data at yourmorals.org, so viewers can go to yourmorals.org and actually take the Moral Foundations questionnaire. What we find is that we do get a very large group of liberals with very high settings on harm and fairness, and very low on the other three, and we get a big group of conservatives who have high values on all five. We also get libertarians who are low on harm and fairness, who are, well, somewhat low, like conservatives, but they're very low on in-group authority purity, more like liberals. And so they've sort of got the volume turned down across the board. Libertarians, in a sense, are saying, stop this moral regulation stuff. Let everyone do what they want. And we get the religious left, people on the religious left who are pretty high. It's like they've got the volume turned up high on all the slider switches. And they're basically saying, yes, Jesus cared an awful lot about the poor and about justice. So those are the liberal concerns. But he also told us to live in ways that were respectful and respectful of our elders and that maintain some kind of purity and some concerns about our body. Sorry, I'm not up on my theology. I shouldn't talk about what Jesus said, except to say that people on the religious left seem to have fairly high settings on all five.
So in our culture right now, we find that these first two kinds of foundations, issues of harm and issues of fairness, are pretty much universal. But do you think that's just, as it were, the contingencies of history, that at some future time in some other society, there might be people who were just cared about the consequences, just wanted to avoid harm and showed very little interest of fairness? Or do you think there's something about those two in particular that they're always going to be universal, not just at this time in our culture?
Well, I think there's a lot of interesting neuroscience research. James Blair and others are studying reactions to violence, and the amygdala seems to particularly cue us into violence and harm. So I think all of our brains are set to react to harm to some degree, except for psychopaths. And then the evidence on reciprocity is just so powerful across cultures. I don't think we'll ever find a society that doesn't care about fairness or justice. On the other hand, one of the ideas I'm really trying to advance here is it's not just that we have these settings in our heads. Ultimately, our moralities and our ideologies are constructed. We play a role in working them out and working out theories and accepting things that we hear and joining political parties. And these ideologies are complex narratives. They're constructions that are built differentially across the five foundations. So you do sometimes take any of those foundations. You can get an extreme morality constructed that really just values the one. And so I think Peter Singer, for example, it would be an example of arguably the most consistent moral philosopher out there. He basically says, let's just take the harm foundation. Let's just take that. Good and bad is what causes the least harm, and then we can very consistently there are no conflicts because it's always clear what to do. There are complexities of application, of course, but you could have an ethos that is so concerned about harm and suffering that it actually is perfectly willing to violate people's rights and treat them unfairly. Or you could have an extreme one on fairness that doesn't care whether there are people suffering as long as everyone is treated fairly. You could have one on in-group. The Nazis had actually really five foundation morality, but in-group was turned up to 11, as they would say in Spinal Tap, for Nazis. So you can have an extreme morality based on any of them.
So
they're not healthy.
So I wonder if we look at, say, liberals and conservatives and how they differ in their views, say, about in-group or about purity, then I wonder if the liberals, for example, just believe that it's okay for people to be homosexual.
I'm sorry, Josh. I'm losing you here. There's some other conversation coming in on our phone line.
Oh.
Okay, try it again.
Okay. If we look at liberals and conservatives, we find that liberals are much more tolerant of things like, for example, homosexuality. But do you think that that's because they immediately have an intuition that homosexuality is okay? Or that liberals are often much less interested in the in-group, their own racial in-group? But do you think that's because they have an immediate intuition? Or do you think that liberals are often kind of racist and homophobic at an intuitive level, but then think about it and try to override their intuitive racism or homophobia?
I think that there are some definite differences in our initial gut feelings, because the number one personality correlate of liberalism is openness to experience, and people who just like variety for variety's sake, people who go to a restaurant and will deliberately order something they've never had before because they're curious. Those people, that's a very good predictor of who you're going to vote for. Whereas people who like to stay with the tried and true, do what's always been done, those people are more likely to vote conservative and vote Republican. So I think that in terms of alternative lifestyles, that's the very definition of it. You say it's an alternative lifestyle, alternative music, the idea that you want to do things that are different, see things that are different, value difference for different sake, that's part of the liberal temperament. So I know you keep pushing to find out if we can explain everything in terms of similar intuitions and different processing afterwards, but I think it's a little of both.
Excellent. So this is an excellent point, but so far we've been talking just about the proximal level of what sort of intuitions people have immediately when you ask them. But now we could turn maybe to a more evolutionary question of why is it that people come to have these intuitions in the first place?
Right.
So we've noted that people have intuitions regarding questions about harm and questions about fairness, but it seems as though there's been less attention paid, at least traditionally, in the literature on evolutionary psychology about why people have these intuitions about the importance of the in-group, the importance of authority, the importance of purity. So maybe we could hear your thoughts about why these kinds of things have ended up playing such a role in our cognition.
Sure. There are a couple of real problems in academic life. One of them is that in the sciences we place this incredible value on parsimony, and we like our theories to be as simple as possible. As Einstein said, things should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. In practice, in academe sciences, we want things as simple as possible, period. So we tend to like theories that use a single principle, and so evolutionary theories that build up from two individuals interacting, game theory with two agents, that's the approach we've taken, and from that you can derive reciprocity. Tit for tat, reciprocal altruism. The other thing that's easy to derive is kin selection. Just from the logic of genes, sometimes it makes sense to help those who share your genes. So almost all thinking about the origin of morality, the evolutionary origin, is focused on those two processes. And from those two, you can derive fairness, justice, social contract theory. You can derive a moral order in which each individual is better off participating. And that's where things stop. That's pretty much where moral psychology has stopped. Is basically there's sort of kinship concerns, and then there's reciprocity, fairness, justice concerns. But there's a whole nother line of thinking about the origin of morality that I think is going to be a revolution over the next 10 years. And this is the idea that evolution doesn't just work by individuals competing within groups. Evolution also works by groups competing with other groups. Now, you see this very clearly with bees and ants and other animals that are ultra-social, that basically it's one for all for one, and the colony survives only if everybody pitches in and doesn't pursue their own interest. So for bees and ants and wasps and termites, group-level selection has been absolutely fundamental, and they are incredibly virtuous, according to many 18th century observers, non-selfish, concerned with the good of the group. But especially since the 1960s, since a book by George Williams and then later Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, it's been almost illegal to think about or talk about group-level selection for humans. But it turns out that the banishment of group selection for humans was premature. It was based on very simple models, computer models, in which agents interact, and you basically find in those simple models that selection pressures for selfishness, selection pressures for screwing your neighbor, for cheating your neighbor, always overwhelm whatever tiny advantage you would get from contributing to the good of the group. Humans, it turns out, though, aren't like that. Humans have culture, and a lot of what culture does is figure out ways to punish free riders. Religion is part of that, gossip. We do so many things that, in a sense, make us a little bit more like bees and ants and termites. That is, human beings got where we are today. We are the only, there are two ultra-social mammals. There are the naked mole rats, who it turns out live very much like bees and wasps. They have a queen and a king. But we are the only other mammal that is ultra-social. And it's starting now, I believe, a revolution in social science thinking when we realize again, that human nature was shaped, yes, largely by the competition of each individual against his or her neighbors, within group competition, yes. But our basic our basic social nature was shaped in part, it appears, by competition across groups. We are the descendants of people who were good at banding together, good at cooperating in mutual defense, good at war and raiding, good at farming, good at the sorts of group activities that led to flourishing over the last 10,000 years. So once you look at it this way, and you realize, you know what, morality isn't just about whether I treat you well. Morality I'm talking only descriptively here, our human moral nature should be understood in part as a preparation, an adaptation for cohesion, for ultrasociality, for extreme levels of cooperation. And when you look at it that way, many of the conservative virtues, I believe, make a lot more sense. Conservative and religious virtues make a lot more sense.
So is group selection going to explain only authority and in-group cohesion, or is it also going to explain purity norms?
Purity would take us a long time to really talk that through, but the idea that one of the core ideas underlying purity cultures is that we within the family, we within the tribe, are all linked by common substance, common fluid, so that whatever you take into you spreads to me as well. The logic of this, the evolutionary logic, was in avoiding bacteria, parasites, other things that spread that were contagious. But human beings are amazingly creative. We take psychological systems that may have evolved to help us figure out what to eat, and we reuse them in so many ways to organize our groups and our societies. I think that's what's happened with purity and disgust. When you look at cultures such as Jews, Muslims, Hindus, where they have very elaborate rules about purity and pollution, these are not just individual requirements. These are part of group bonding, part of creating a group that ultimately is like a superorganism. That is, a group that, just as bees found a way, as it were, metaphorically speaking, bees sort of found a way to move through what's called a major transition up to a higher level of organization. Human groups often have used these ideas of purity, authority, and in-group to create a kind of a superorganism, at least a social group that functions more as one, at least, or can function as one when under attack or in times of
So do you think we see the same kind of thing going on in contemporary groups, like the people who eat tofu and tempeh and go to whole food co-ops and so forth? Are these people creating group cohesion around a certain kind of food?
Yes, to some extent. I think it's often said, herding liberals is like herding cats. The Democratic whip in Congress has a much harder job than the Republican whip. So I think that liberals, it's often harder to get them to cohere into a tight group. But yes, I do think, as I said, morality is a team sport. And to the extent that eating organic foods or vegan or any of the other food-related issues that are so important for many liberals in particular, those do become badges. Those are like, gangs have gang signs. They wear certain colors. They do certain things. And if you don't do it, you're not a member of the group. So I think that's part of our group cohesion software, as it were. And you do see that on the left as well as the right, yes.
So, but on your view, the kind of psychological process that we see in, for example, gang colors, are you thinking that same psychological process is what makes people opposed to homosexuality or to miscegenation or to other kinds of sexual acts that they disapprove of?
Yeah, to some extent, yes, because again, it's not that some people are just set to be anti-gay; others are set to be pro-gay. What I'm trying to say is that there are some settings underneath that make some people, it's easier to make them anti-gay or pro-gay, and that's the openness to experience. But look what's happened in America since the 1980s, since the rise of the religious right. The religious right was a very calculated political movement. That it was a moral reaction to what they saw as the excesses, the subversion of the 1960s and 70s. They saw America as falling apart, etc., the sexual revolution, all that. But they chose to make homosexuality a frontline issue, especially I can't remember whether it was specifically the 1992 Republican convention where it was really highlighted. But they did that as a tactical move to rally the troops, and it worked again quite well in 2004. So anti-gay prejudice isn't somehow written into our genes. It's something that can be whipped up and used as a marker. And look on the left. It used to be overwhelmingly race issues. We were united by race issues and abortion. We were pro-choice and anti-racist, and the other side are racist and anti-choice. And now that's shifting a bit. I think as the environment takes on much greater importance. So the team, sort of the badges, the key moral issues that we all rally around, those change. But this brings up a really important point in understanding morality as a team sport. You have to think of the concept of a what's called a maypole. A maypole, a tall pole with all these strings around it, and the townspeople would each grab a string and you go in circles and you weave it all together, and it's a great little ritual for creating a single fabric out of a lot of different individuals. Mm-hmm. Moral issues and gods, I believe, are maypoles. They are things we can rally around. That doesn't mean that they're arbitrary and irrelevant, but it does mean that any moral campaign, anything that people really care about, gay marriage, whatever, has a social function, has a very important social function, and that is to bring people together so they can compete with other groups.
So if we think now about this kind of coalitional thinking that individuals in our society are so often involved in, there are sort of two different ways in which you might think that this coalitional thinking evolved. So one is that you might think that the coalitional thinking is enabling individuals within our culture to, say, outcompete other individuals. Let's say certain individuals in the group can do better than other individuals if they're better able to kind of cohere with the coalition. And then another approach would be that groups which have coalitional thinking are going to outcompete other groups that have less coalitional thinking, even if the individuals within the group who have less coalitional thinking do no worse than the individuals who have more coalitional thinking. So are you now suggesting that the second one is the right one and that the first one is the wrong one?
The trick here is not to say, is it group level selection or is it individual level selection? The trick is to say it's multi-level selection. Mm-hmm. And this was Williams and Dawkins were quite explicit about this, and they were right about this, to say that both are always going on. It's just a question of degree. And Williams and Dawkins concluded that from various models and arguments at the time, the effect size of the group level selection was so minuscule that it could be ignored. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out that that's just not true. It turns out that evolution works a lot faster, that wars have been going on a lot longer, that our ancestors lived in very groupish tribal ways in which those groups that could outcompete other groups went on to found empires and have lots of children and spawn and cover continents. So the way to think about it is there's always a degree to which groups are competing with groups, and there's always a degree to which individuals are competing with individuals within those groups. Mm-hmm. We are not ants and termites. And even ants and termites, it turns out, there is the same dynamic going on. It's just that the vectors are set such that the overwhelming dynamic is the group level. But there is still some selfishness where they try to sort of trick or outbreed the others. So you have to look at both happening. And we in the West have created orderly, free societies in which the need for tribalism, the need to band together to fight other groups, has been minimalized. Mm-hmm. And I think that creates a much more humane, open society. If you don't have law, if you don't have police, you have to have basically male structures that ultimately can back up the welfare of the group with force if necessary. So when in the Old South, in Sicily, in a lot of mountainous regions where there is no centralized authority, you tend to get these much more five-foundation, thick, patriarchal, authoritarian sorts of moralities. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to now bring history in as well as evolution and culture. You have to bring in historical and economic changes that have shaped our morality.
So far we've just been talking about this coalitional thinking from a purely descriptive point of view, just trying to understand the psychology of these different groups. But suppose we turn now to what philosophers usually call a normative question, and we ask whether there's actually something good about this. So if we look in contemporary society, we see some groups in which there's a strong coalitional cohesion, in which the group really sees itself as a group and has values in-group loyalty, and others in which that's much less true. So do you think there's something valuable about this idea you've associated with conservatism of strong in-group loyalty?
Yes, I do. So let's make the move to normative considerations here. And my normative considerations are pretty simple. Ultimately, I'm a kind of a utilitarian. I would say a kind of an expansive utilitarian. That is, let's take human welfare, all things considered, and let's look at what kinds of social systems and moral structures maximize human welfare, all things considered. And as it turns out, the empirical evidence suggests, it's complicated correlational studies, but many studies seem to point the same way, which is that at least within the United States, it's very clear that conservatives are happier than liberals, religious people are happier than atheists, people who play sports, people who belong to fraternities, basically people who, in a sense, get to live more in the ways that we humans evolved to live, that is, with a strong sense of belonging to cohesive groups. Those people are happier. Now, that's not the end of the story, because strong group loyalties can often lead to cross-group conflicts and violence, so it's not just we're going to take a vote here and let the happiest people dictate how we should live.
Yeah.
But I think we academics, we policy people, the sorts of intellectuals who would even be watching us on Blogging Heads, we tend to be liberal, very liberal. We tend to have two foundation morality, and we tend to simply not be able to perceive these other moral concerns. We tend to not, it's as though you asked people to imagine what would it be like, what would it be like to see in infrared, and they say, well, I can imagine that. I'll bet it would be really, really red. But we can't imagine. We don't know what it'd be like. And if somebody's colorblind or somebody saw only in black and white, and you say, well, just think about color. I mean, it's very hard to do. And what I found when I talk about this stuff is that liberals and political theorists and people who really want a kind of a contractualist Enlightenment society, they just discount all that groupish collectivist stuff. They don't appreciate it. But I think in this language of just, look, it looks like it does seem to contribute to human flourishing, I think we've got to take it seriously.
So here we've been talking about just one of the three foundations that are held more by conservatives than by liberals. That is to say, in-group loyalty. But do you think there's also something valuable about purity norms and about norms of authority? Yeah.
Well, let's start with authority, because I think that's the larger one. And that is the one that I think is really the most difficult for liberals, because liberalism many branches of liberalism are almost defined by an anti-authoritarianism, a sort of a radical egalitarianism that says if there are hierarchies, they ought to be dismantled. And that made a lot of sense in the 60s, I think, when there were hierarchies that enforced racial and sexual discrimination. So it made sense to tear them all down then. But I think there's an emerging sense, there's research coming out of a lot of areas showing that you do need authority, predictability. You certainly need, for groups to function, you need deviants to be punished. You need laws enforced. There's some interesting research by Richard Aram on school failures and how the terrible state of our public schools is due in part to the radical erosion of authority within schools by the litigation culture that began in the 70s. So I think one of the great conservative insights, one of the real insights I've gotten, look, I'm a liberal, I'm an academic liberal, but I read a lot of conservative sources, I watch conservative news programs, and one of the great insights I've gotten from some of the classic conservative thinkers is that authority, predictability, the value of traditions, all of these things contribute to making an orderly society in which we can all flourish. And when things are in flux, it's just much harder to get your bearings. You tend to get a kind of a collapse down to more selfishness. So this was one of the points that Emil Durkheim made in his famous study of suicide. When you have the collapse of authority and of shared norms and traditions, you have a rise in anomie. And you have a rise in anomie, you have a rise in depression and suicide.
And if we turn then to purity norms?
So purity, one way to think about purity is this: is life just a material process in which we can do with it as we please, or are our bodies temples in some way? Are there some things that we shouldn't do even if there's a utilitarian justification for doing it? When I spent some time in India, I really came to feel that in India there's a kind of a topography of sacredness, the physical landscape. I mean, some spots are sacred, some are polluted. And I really felt as though in America it was like living on the plains. Everything's at the same altitude, whereas in India there's high and low. Now, is that good in some sense? Look now at conservative ideas about say, bioethical issues. If you're a liberal, it's quite obvious that people should be able to choose what they want to do with their bodies, be it abortion or euthanasia, cloning, anything else. If you're not hurting anyone, you should be able to do what you want. The argument from Leon Kass, an argument that is kind of a lightning rod for criticism among many philosophers, is that there is some wisdom in repugnance, that we are, in a sense, better off if we don't just do what we want and maximize utility directly. In a sense, you could say, to maximize utility ultimately sometimes requires us to not maximize utility directly. Now, translating that into any specific policy, euthanasia policies, it's kind of hard for me to justify not letting people end their lives if they choose to. But I think the idea here is that many people want to live in a society in which there are things that are sacred and there are things that unite people in pointing them to the right way to live. There are others who want to live in a society that is so open that anyone can do what they want. Part of that, I think, is ultimately temperament. You and me and most people in philosophy and psychology, we don't really want a world in which anything is particularly sacred, other than individual rights and autonomy. We make individuals sacred. So doing the normative job here, I'm not ready. Ask me again in a few years. These are the hardest issues to work through.
So but before we conclude, I wanted to ask one last question, and that is, so far we've been talking about the psychological study of how people differ along these dimensions. So what I want to ask is, what might be the normative implications of that psychological study? How can studying these kinds of empirical questions about why liberals and conservatives differ actually help us in our lives to get along with each other?
Yeah. Well, the most important. There's so many ways, I think. I just read your wonderful paper on Nietzschean moral psychology, and you make the point there that philosophical work on, say, along the Kantian tradition makes certain assumptions about people's ability to govern their lives by principles. The Aristotelian tradition makes certain assumptions about how we acquire virtues in childhood. So all of this philosophical work rests on certain psychological assumptions, which are often unstated. And when those psychological assumptions can be shown to be wrong, the philosophical edifice may well collapse. So I think it is incumbent on anyone doing normative work to get the right psychology, and you have to understand the kind of creatures you're legislating for. So that's the first thing. The second is that we can also easily see the psychology of us versus them when it's played out elsewhere. And we can see how people get blinded and biased and how bad their thinking is when they're partisans in a debate. But it's very hard to realize that that's true of all of us. The greatest experience of my life was those 3 months I spent in India, really trying to understand a moral culture that was radically opposed to my own, that was very hierarchical, religious, sex-segregated, purity-based. And I went over there not to criticize them. I went over there to try to pretend I was an anthropologist and try to understand them in their terms. And once I did that, once I liked these people, and I because I liked them, I was much more open to understanding what they thought they were doing. But once I came back to America, suddenly the religious right didn't seem like a bunch of insane Nazis. I didn't agree with them, but at least I understood that they were fully morally motivated. They were trying to build a moral world that had some good things about it, and that was a reaction to some excesses on the left. So I think doing kind of moral field work, understanding that morality does vary, no one group has it right for all time and for all ways of living, it can open you up to seeing, first of all, it helps you stop demonizing your opponents, and that's the first step, is you've got to at least respect the other side before you can honestly disagree with them. And secondly, it's ultimately really freeing. I feel like once I started doing this work on politics, once I started really trying to understand conservatives, it was so liberating. When I first started watching Fox News, it was like, getting into a freezing cold pool. It's like, oh, I don't want to dip my toe in. Oh, God, this is so awful to watch Hannity and Combs and all that stuff. Once I got over that initial shock, I just found it really interesting, and I find it, it's so much more interesting to come to understand the other side than it is to just read more stuff from our side, which you kind of already knew anyway. I think it can free you from basically, look, morality is a team sport, and if you want to step off the playing field for a little while and study it from the stands, study moral psychology.
Okay, well, thank you for engaging with me in this team sport, and it's been great talking with you.
It was a very collaborative. I think we're on the same team here, Josh. So
okay,
thank you.
I'll speak with you later.
Okay, bye bye.